All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season, which means we are in the first round of the 2024 fantasy football playoffs. So you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, break down every single quarterback and tight end, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting as we move in to week 15. All right, let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Rams traveling to face the San Francisco 49ers. So let's take a look at the Rams first and foremost. I think Matthew Stafford is a good streaming option. I was very close to putting Stafford in the start category this week, but it's not the best matchup here against the Niners on a short week. And I know the Niners defense has been a little bit wishy-washy as of late, but they did look good this past week. At home against the Bears. They're at home this week. It's a short week. I think Stafford is a fine start, but he's just a streaming option for me this week because we have no teams on bye week. I think he can probably get through with better options, but he does have 15 or more fantasy points in his last 4 starts. Looked really good this past week. 20.8 fantasy points, 23 of 30, 320 passing yards, and 2 passing touchdowns. He now has 2 or more passing touchdowns in every game since week 8, except for that week 10 matchup against Miami. So I think Stafford is perfectly fine, but I don't know if he's like a clear-cut must-start quarterback this week. But he is certainly very startable, and we'll see what happens for sure. In terms of the Rams tight ends, there's nobody here from a fantasy perspective that you guys even need to consider. Now, speaking of the Niners this past week, the offense also looked much better than what we had gotten out of backup quarterback in week 12 and then an awful snow game against Buffalo, right? 22.1 fantasy points in week 14 for Brock Purdy, 20 of 25, 325 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. And while I do typically try to avoid short week games, this is a great matchup as the Rams have given up the 25th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So I think Brock Purdy, the QB 12 on the season, is a strong start this week. I have no problem whatsoever having him in my starting lineup. George Kittle remains a must start on a week-to-week basis, no matter what. We've really only seen one bad performance, and that was in the snow against Buffalo when everybody was bad out of Kittle on the season. Week 1, 8 points, sure, not that great. But outside of that, every other game he's played in, except for those 2, double digits. He had 21.1 fantasy points this past week. You're not benching George Kittle no matter what. So Purdy, Kittle, strong start. Stafford, okay, but kind of in the streaming category for me this week. No tight ends to consider for the Rams here in week 15. Moving into Sunday's action, we're going to have the Commanders traveling to face the Saints. And let's start with the Commanders side of things, who could come out in very strong fashion against a very decimated Saints team here, although they're not as decimated on the defense, right? But Jaden Daniels, a quarterback over the past couple weeks that I have considered a must-start quarterback and a quarterback that I encouraged you guys to get back into your fantasy lineups weeks 12 and 13 of the season and have trust in him. And he had 28-plus fantasy points in his last 2 games with 32.4 against Dallas in week 12. So obviously the Commanders on bye week this past week. You got Jaden Daniels. He's your QB6 in fantasy. Keep rolling with him. He could have a huge day here in week 15. Zach Ertz is your tight end 10 on the season, 12.5 or more fantasy points in his last 3 games, 3 touchdowns in his last 3 games. Keep rolling with Zach Ertz. He's a strong start. The ceiling's not always crazy high with Ertz, but he continues to be a player that you can trust on a week in, week out basis. Players that you can't trust are probably going to be the Saints quarterbacks, and I guess their tight ends as well. Derek Carr not going to be playing this week. He's not going on IR as he's dealing with that hand injury, but maybe he should just go on IR. Nonetheless, Jake Haener, Spencer Rattler, whoever it's going to be, and we're all assuming it is actually going to be Jake Haener this week, not going to be a start from a fantasy perspective. Even in deep super flex leagues, we're not touching Jake Hanner with a 10-foot pole. Juwan Johnson did come through this past week against the Giants in a tough matchup. Believe it or not, the Giants good against tight ends. 15 fantasy points, 5 targets, 4 grabs, 50 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And Foster Moreau also had a big play in that game as well, but just 2 catches for a total of 40 receiving yards. I just don't think we really need to go there. Plus, we have very low quality quarterback play throwing to these guys. So, I mean, in a very desperate situation in like a 16-team league, you got nothing else. Juwan Johnson probably worth a shot, but outside of that, I'm staying away from the Saints quarterbacks and tight ends here in Week 15. Next up, we'll have the Chiefs traveling to face the Browns. This should be an interesting matchup. Let's start with the Chiefs side of things. I have Patrick Mahomes still as a start, and he has kind of started to tier maybe closer to the streaming area, but he's still your QB 11 on the season so far. He still has 16-plus fantasy points in every game since Week 8, except for this past week, and it was a tough matchup against the Chargers. He was 24 of 37, 210 passing yards, a passing touchdown, and that was it. But against this Cleveland Browns defense that's not so great against quarterbacks and wide receivers, I think Patrick Mahomes is definitely startable this week, but you of course want to look at what other options you have at the quarterback position, because we've just seen Mahomes' upside kind of capped for a majority of the season. We only have 19-plus fantasy points in 3 of Mahomes' games so far on the season, so just bear that in mind. And I'm keeping Travis Kelce in the start category. 9.5 fantasy points this past week, 6 targets, 5 grabs, 45 receiving yards. But you take away that game in Week 11, he's given you 12.2 or more fantasy points in every game since Week 8. So tight end 9 on the season. I'm still good with rolling with Travis Kelce. Now, I was very close to taking Noah Gray out of the streaming area, but he still had 5 targets this past week, 4 grabs, just 26 receiving yards, 6.6 fantasy points. But I'll say, he's kind of close to that Juwan Johnson area. You're really only going to stream Noah Gray if you're absolutely desperate. When he had some of those better games in the past couple of weeks, it was mainly against defenses who are not good against the tight end position outside of the Week 11 matchup against Buffalo. So he's fine if you need points and there's nothing out there, but for the most part, I don't think you guys need to be going out of your way to start Noah Gray. We'll see what happens this week. He always does have some potential touchdown upside. Now, Jameis Winston, king of the streaming category, 17.2 fantasy points this past week, 24 of 41, 212 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 2 picks, 28 yards on the ground, a fumble. I mean, this is Jameis Winston in a nutshell. He has thrown the ball 41 or more times in every game outside of the snow game in Week 12. I mean, he's going to sling it. He's going to throw picks. He's going to throw some touchdowns. He's fine. He's, like I said, the king of the streaming area. Not a bad matchup against the Chiefs, so you can definitely roll with them, but you got to understand the risk. And I'll leave it at that. David Njoku, a strong start this week, 17.2 fantasy points this past week, 13 targets, 7 grabs, 42 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He's been pretty dang good over the past couple weeks outside of the snow game. He has 7.9 or more fantasy points in every game since Week 6, double digits in all those games except for 3 of them, including the snow games. So Njoku, you're tied at 11 on this season, gets a lot of red zone looks from Jameis Winston. Keep rolling with Njoku if you own him. All right, next up we have the Bengals, who are traveling to face the Titans, and let's start with Joe Burrow, your quarterback 3. On the season, you are obviously starting him no matter what. The Bengals have not been eliminated from playoff contention. This is another must-win game on the road here, so you own Burrow. Keep rolling with him. There's no reason not to. He's had 20 or more fantasy points in every game since Week 9. 33 of 44 this past week, 369 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and 1 interception. That wasn't really his fault. So you own Burrow. There's no discussion here. Unless the Bengals get eliminated from playoff contention, then you have some sort of argument. But come on. You own Burrow, nothing to talk about here. And Joe Burrow has now thrown for more than 309 passing yards in 4 straight games, and his current line on Underdog is only sitting at 278.5 passing yards. I am headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Burrow's total passing yards. If you guys don't know already, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, will get a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 15's action. Take your free Pick'em. Take the over on Joe Burrow's total passing yards. Once both of those lines hit, you'll automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, when you sign up on Underdog using promo code TheCatch, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Gesicki 5.4 fantasy points this past week, 3 targets, 3 grabs, 24 receiving yards. Just not enough there for me. We're sitting Mike Gesicki. Will Levis is going into the week as questionable, and he sure looked like the Will Levis that we're used to this past week against the Jaguars. 19 of 32, 168 passing yards, no touchdowns, no picks, a fumble, and 3 yards on the ground. I was close to making the argument that you could stream Levis this week because the matchup is great. I mean, Cooper Rush just had 18 fantasy points against this defense, but I'm just out. I'm done. You know, I had made this kind of case for Will Levis as a streaming quarterback based on his schedule and that kind of like floor area. I mean, he had 16 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games before this past week, and now in the fantasy playoffs, he has a phenomenal schedule. Cincy, Indianapolis, Jacksonville. I'm just out. There's other options. You can find somebody else. Let's not risk it. I don't want you guys to end up with 7 fantasy points in your starting lineup like you would have got this past week. Chicken Conquo, Josh Weil, any tight end for the Titans, I'm out here. We're not touching them. No fantasy relevance there. So, Joe Burrow, that's it for quarterbacks and tight ends in this Week 15 matchup. Moving along, we'll have the Dolphins who are traveling to face the Texans. Tua Tagovailoa, since week 11 of the season, is your quarterback 3 on the season. 23.5 fantasy points, 33 of 47, 331 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 2 or more passing touchdowns, 288 or more passing yards in every game over the past 4 weeks for Tua. You got to start him. This Texans secondary, it's not good. So Tua, very strong start this week. Johnny Smith, my must-start tight end of this past week, a tight end that we have called just a literal, you have to start him if you own him. Put him in the flex if you have to. Tight end over the past couple of weeks, right? Tight end 3 on the season now is Johnny Smith. 13.4 fantasy points, and one of my favorite fantasy performances of the entire season of any player at any position. No catches. And then in overtime, 4 targets, 3 catches, 44 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, 13.4 fantasy points. Miraculous game by Jonnu Smith. Keep rolling with them. No reason not to. Now, there's plenty of reason to not roll with C.J. Stroud moving forward. I was ready to take him out as, like, I've left him in the area for, like, the last 2 games. And in Week 13, because the Texans were on bye week this past week, we left him there, although I really wanted to put him as a sit because he had a matchup against the Jags, and he finished with 14.3 fantasy points. So I'm just done with C.J. Stroud. It's not a great matchup here against the Dolphins. Sure, maybe he gets you 16-ish points, or maybe gets you 11 points. You know, I'm just done. He's your QB 19 on the season. There's no real upside here. The Texans are going to make the playoffs. Like, they're going to be a lower seed, but they're basically secured into the playoffs. I know the Colts, I guess, could give them a run here theoretically, but, you know, I just, there's nothing about C.J. Stroud that makes me want to start him in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. If he has a big game, so be it, but the floor here is so low. I'm just dumb. Dalton Schultz, I mean, he did have a nice game in Week 13 against one of the worst teams in the league against tight ends, but outside of that, he hasn't hit double digits on the entirety of the season. There's nothing here for me from the Texans in terms of quarterbacks and tight ends. There's plenty here for the Dolphins when it comes to quarterbacks and tight ends in Week 15. Next up, we'll have the Ravens, who are traveling to face the Giants. Talk about 2 different teams here. Nonetheless, Lamar Jackson is your QB1 on the season. 25.3 fantasy points in his last start in Week 13 as the Ravens were on bye week this past week. Mark Andrews is your tight end 6 on the season. He had 18.9 fantasy points in that last start as well. keep rolling with both of these guys. This is a great matchup against the Giants, who, as I mentioned earlier, the Giants have been surprisingly good against tight ends, but not worried about it. The Ravens should come out here and have a big offensive day. My only concern would be them kind of pulling ahead early, but you never know. We'll see what happens, and you could see a strong performance out of Derrick Henry in this Ravens defense this week, and that could stifle some upside out of Lamar and Andrews, but you never know. Any given Sunday, right? Worth noting, Isaiah Likely did have a big day against the Eagles as well, 14.8 fantasy points, but we've seen double digits 3 times out of Likely on the season, just not consistent whatsoever, so I'm not going to bank on Isaiah Likely being a starter in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. Now, going into the week, we have Drew Lock as questionable. The Giants have said if he is good to go, he will be the starter this week. So I'm going to avoid him. 15.9 fantasy points this past week, and I'll just leave it at that. If it's Tommy DeVito, I'm also going to avoid him. And since Theo Johnson headed to IR, there's no real tight end caliber starter for the Giants here in fantasy, and Theo Johnson was hardly even in that category. So I'm staying away from all Giants tight ends and quarterbacks, as you guys could have probably guessed. And let's roll with Lamar and Mark Andrews with confidence here in Week 15. Next up, we have the Jets, who will travel to face the Jaguars in the most meaningless game on the season so far. Let's take a look at the Jets to start. Aaron Rodgers, he's been playing okay-ish, 15 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, 2 passing touchdowns in 2 of those 3 games, 17.5 fantasy points this past week. Jets showed some life in a game that they had to win to stay in the playoff hunt, and they lost 27-39, 339 passing yards, a tutty. Yeah, it's not a bad matchup, don't get me wrong. He might be desperate in the Superflex format, and sure, Rodgers can probably give you that floor, as he's going to play this week, it looks like. The latest story on Rodgers is that he has played with a hamstring, knee, and ankle injury this year. So the Jets sucking total ass this year is not Aaron Rodgers' fault. It is everybody else's, because he's been hurt the whole season. He's just a sit for me. Come on, what's the real upside here? It's just not there. Sure, the matchup's fine, but the Jags surprisingly haven't been that bad when it comes to fantasy points allowed over the past few weeks to quarterbacks. So I don't think I need to break this down. I'm avoiding Aaron Rodgers if I can. Tyler Conklin, super low ceiling, just staying away here as well. And when it comes to the Jags, there's just nothing here really. Mac Jones came back to earth after a solid performance in Week 13. Maybe he was just fired up about the hit on Trevor Lawrence. But this past week, 7.1 fantasy points, 2 picks. Just no thank you. And Evan Ingram's ceiling has just really been lowered as well. He's probably still streamable if you're desperate, but I just don't see any real reason to go out here and start Evan Ingram in Week 15. So I've got him as a sit, 7.3 fantasy points this past week. Sure, you can definitely argue he's in that streamable area, but I just don't know if the upside is going to be there with Mac Jones at quarterback. So I'm avoiding this matchup completely in Week 15. Moving along, we have the Cowboys, who are going to travel to face the Panthers. Let's start with Cooper Rush, who I do think is streamable. I misspoke earlier in the video. I said he had 18 fantasy points. I thought he did. He only had 14.8, so my mistake. You guys can roast me in the comments like you usually do anyways. He was 16 of 31, 183 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, threw a pick. I think he is a desperation streaming option. He does have 17.3 or more fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games. He's not really playing that bad. He's just not putting up huge fantasy numbers. So if you are very, very desperate due to the matchup here against the Panthers, on paper it is a good matchup, but we do want to consider that the Panthers' defense has been playing much better in the past couple weeks as well, and they're not really looking like a team that's just going to roll over, but they're still giving up the 26th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So, you want to take shot here in a deep super flex format, or you're desperate in a dynasty league or something, go for it. And the Panthers also awful against tight ends, giving up the most fantasy points of any team to the position. So I've got Ferguson and Schoonmaker as pure desperation streams. I should probably put something on the screen for, those of you guys who just look at the graphics here, because these are like the most extreme streaming options this week. You have to be really desperate to start these guys. Ferguson, 6 targets, 3 grabs, 6.2 fantasy points this past week in a really good matchup, but Schoonmaker still got some looks, 2 targets, 2 grabs, 4.2 fantasy points. So I don't know who Cooper Rush is really going to prefer. He did obviously give more volume to Ferguson this past week, but if you're absolutely desperate, you could take a look at some of the Cowboys starters due to the matchup here. And then looking at the Panthers, Bryce Young, give him his flowers. He's been very good over the past couple weeks compared to what we're used to. Very happy to see it, and I had Bryce Young as a streaming option in Week 13 due to the matchup against the Bucs. Then this past week, I told you guys not going to be there against the Eagles, and he kept the offense in the game, but just 13.5 fantasy points. So very big difference between real-life football play and fantasy football play. So avoiding Bryce Young this week. No reason that you guys need to go out and start him. I would rather start Cooper Rush than Bryce Young for what it's worth. Jatavion Sanders was able to play in Week 14 after missing Week 13, but had just 1 target. Tommy Tremble did score a touchdown and have 7.3 fantasy points, but, we don't need to go there. You'd have to be like a 20-man league to be looking at Tommy Tremble, in my opinion. So, yeah, this matchup, not great here. Not anybody that you really need to go out of your way in any format to start, but you do have some streaming potential when it comes to the Cowboys players here in Week 15. Next up, we will have the Buccaneers traveling to face the Chargers, and this is a tough matchup this week for Baker Mayfield and company, so kind of went back and forth here on Baker and Cade Otton, but I think they're both very startable still, just tough players to bench. Baker Mayfield, still your quarterback 5 on the season, coming off of his best performance since Week 8 of the year. 21 fantasy points, 18 of 29, 295 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 2 picks, a lost fumble. He has had more turnovers as of late, but I think Baker's fine, but he's kind of in like the lower tier of starts for me this week because it is a tough matchup on the road against the Chargers here. Cade Otton, 10 fantasy points this past week, 4 targets, 3 grabs, 70 receiving yards. Startable, but once again in a lower tier because it's a tough matchup against the Chargers. So see what happens, but if those are the guys you got to roll with, I think it's fine. I just think they have lower ceilings potentially this week. Now, Justin Herbert, a little banged up, has a left leg contusion. So I'm kind of split on Herbert. I was very close to putting him as a sit, and Herbert's been hurt since the offseason. Different injuries going on all season long, so that does concern me. But actually what concerns me more is the status of Ladd McConkey and the fact that Will Dissly is now going to miss a few weeks at the tight end position, and J.K. Dobbins is still on IR. So, this team is hurting pretty badly with some of their best playmakers and pass catchers, right? So it's a good matchup against the Bucs. The Chargers are at home, but Herbert's banged up. All those other guys are banged up. The upside really gets capped for Justin Herbert here, who's had 13.7 or less fantasy points in 2 straight games. But if Ladd McConkey is able to play this week, I think Herbert is startable, but he's just in the category for me. Like, could give you a floor, but only if Ladd plays, because then that really opens things up. We saw Quinn Johnston have a good game this past week. Josh Palmer have a good game this past week. So against this Bucs secondary, like, if all the receivers are healthy, sure, I can see a 3 or 2 touchdown game out of Herbert coming because that's how bad the Bucs secondary is. But how efficiently can they move the ball when the run game's really been struggling? The Bucs have been better against the run as of late. Who's their starting tight end this week? It's not Hayden Hurst. He's on IR. It's not going to be Will Dissly. So Stone Smart and Tucker Fisk. Those are the next tight ends up for the Chargers. So, I just don't think Herbert is a great start this week. But if Ladd McConkey plays, he could be startable. And speaking of the tight ends here, they're all going to be sits for me because I don't know who these guys are. So we'll see what happens in this matchup between the Bucs and the Chargers in Week 15. All right, next up we have the Colts who are traveling to face the Broncos. Let's start with the Colts. I'm avoiding Anthony Richardson this week. Probably could be in like the type category. The Broncos defense when we last saw them definitely wasn't intimidating on Monday Night Football against the Browns, and Anthony Richardson when we last saw him, both these teams on bye week in Week 14. Did have 23 fantasy points, but I mean, only threw 109 passing yards, had 48 yards on the ground, 2 passing touchdowns, a rushing touchdown as well. I mean, he might be startable, but I just don't know that you need to risk it on the road against the Broncos. I won't be surprised if he has a good fantasy day, but I won't be surprised if he has like 12 points either. So no teams on bye week. I'm avoiding Anthony Richardson if I can, and there's no tight end on the Colts team that has any relevancy when it comes to fantasy football. So nothing to look at there. Bo Nix, I think, is definitely still startable going into this week. I know he was a little disappointing against Cleveland, but he wasn't that bad. 18 to 35, 295 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 2 picks. So, the Broncos did move the football. They had their fullback running in from like the 2 or 3 yard line, and Javonte Williams scored from the 1 yard line. So I think Nix is fine. He's your QB8 on the season. Good matchup here against the Colts. I'm a believer. I've been a believer for weeks and weeks and weeks before it was a trend. So I think that you can go ahead and start Bo Nix. I got no problem with it. No tight ends who are relevant when it comes to the Broncos in terms of fantasy football. So for me in this matchup, it's just Bo Nix, and that's it. Next up, we have the Patriots who are traveling to face the Cardinals. Let's start with the Patriots, and Drake May, not so bad against the Colts in his last start on bye week this past week, but in Week 13, 20 fantasy points. He's had 20 or more fantasy points in 3 games this year since he became the starter. I just don't know that I trust Drake May. It's the first round of the playoffs. What position are you in that you need to start Drake May? I'm staying away from Drake May. And I'll leave it at that. I don't know if the Cardinals defense is really as good as we were hoping for at the end of the season, but once again, why do you need to start Drake May? I mean, superflex formats, deep superflex formats, sure, the floor might be there, but I'm avoiding him if I can. Hunter Henry lives in the streaming area for me. He has double digits in every game this year since Drake May has been the quarterback, except for 3. And in 2 of those, he at least still had 9.4 or more fantasy points. So Henry, fine. You can roll with him if you have to. He's a good streaming option, but he's nothing more than that. Not a lot of touchdown upside. Kyler Murray is in the category, but he could be closer to the start category. I just don't know what to expect out of this Cardinals offense on a weekly basis. I don't know what the game plan's going to be. I don't know how much James Conner we're going to see. I don't know if we're going to see a good game out of Marvin Harrison Jr. I don't know if Kyler's going to throw 2 picks. I just don't know, right? It's been so all over the place. This past week, 25 of 38, 259 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 2 picks, 16 yards on the ground, 19 fantasy points. And that's the thing, the week before against Minnesota, 17.2 fantasy points, but he had 2 picks. If we could just clear up some of these interceptions, which not all of them have been Kyler's fault, then you'd see much better fantasy stat lines and you'd have some more confidence here. But he just is kind of like a lower tier start for me, and I'll just leave it at that. But it is a pretty good matchup, to say the least, against the Patriots. So if you own him and you have to roll with him, don't get too upset. It's a good matchup at home. Trey McBride has been a very bright spot in the Cardinals offense and has been the most consistent part of the Cardinals offense this year. He has no touchdowns. Well, he has a rushing touchdown, no receiving touchdowns, and he's on pace for the most receiving yards, receptions, and targets by a tight end ever, who has also not scored a touchdown, in case you're wondering. But 14 fantasy points this past week, 14 targets, 7 grabs, 70 receiving yards. You own Trey McBride. Keep rolling with him. There is no reason whatsoever to bench him. So we'll see what happens in this matchup in Week 15. Next up, we have the Bills traveling to face the Lions in what will probably be the best game of the whole week. We'll find out. Josh Allen is a very scary individual, a very bad man. Wow. 51.8 fantasy points on average, in some leagues more. 22 of 37, 342 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 10 rushing attempts, 82 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, the first quarterback to ever throw for 3 passing touchdowns and run for 3 rushing touchdowns. They still found a way to lose. Nonetheless, Josh Allen is your QB2 now on the season, neck and neck there with Lamar Jackson, and you are starting him. It's not a great matchup on the road here, but you're starting Josh Allen. You always start Josh Allen. You don't think twice about it. 20 or more fantasy points in every game since week 6. What a performance this past week. Dalton Kincaid, Dawson Knox, whoever it's going to be, whoever is healthy, just stay away. It's a bad matchup, and these guys haven't even been relevant. And I'm still very angry that Kincaid has been a complete bust this year. Jared Goff, you want to roll with him? Go for it. I mean, 23 fantasy points this past week, 32 of 41, 283 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, a pick, 7 yards on the ground. Great game script. You never know what you're going to get. The past 4 weeks, right? 34 points, 10 points, 16 points, 23 points. He's very startable, but he has a lot of fluctuation, a lot of volatility. You never know what you're going to get. So he's in the category for me. Sam Laporta also in that category, but I think he's a pretty dang good start. I mean, he has had double digits in his last 2 games, but like you look at the last 3 games, 4.9 games, 15.6, 10.4, and in the highest ceiling game there, he only had 3 catches, but 2 of them were touchdowns. So there's still volatility here, and while Laporta is not playing as a tight end that you drafted him to be, he's still a good start, but it's just kind of the nature of this offense right now. So many playmakers, such a strong run game. You just get volatility, but it doesn't mean that they're bad starts. You just have to understand, if you do start a Lions quarterback or tight end, you just don't exactly know what you're going to get. So we'll see what happens with the Lions, but what we do know is that you got to start Josh Allen in Week 15. All right, final game of the afternoon slate is going to be the Steelers traveling to face the Eagles. We'll see what happens here in the Battle of Pennsylvania, right? Anyways, Russell Wilson I have as a sit. You could probably stream Russ if you need to. Not a fantastic matchup here, but it's like, why do you need to stream him this week? And on top of that, George Pickens not going to play this week unless a miracle happens. And as a side note, if you're a George Pickens owner, there's a lot of reason for concern. This is the same injury that Mike Evans suffered, and the Steelers are kind of being hushed about this and maybe trying to be strategic, but Pickens might miss the entire fantasy playoffs. Anyways, that really hurts Russell Wilson this week. You don't really have a true wide receiver here behind Pickens. Like Calvin Austin, Van Jefferson, Mike Williams, they're not getting it done. So I'm pretty worried about Russ this week, and I'm going to sit him in desperation stream. But even then, like, I don't feel very good about it. Pat Freiermuth, solid streaming option. Tight end 12 on the season. He has seen more red zone looks, more volume over the past couple weeks. 2 touchdowns in 2 straight games, 13.8 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games, but better matchups against the Browns and the Bengals in the past 2 weeks. So streamable, and we'll probably get more looks with Pickens out, but proceed with caution. Jalen Hurts. You just got to start Jalen Hurts. I mean, he's your QB4 on the season, 24.2 fantasy points this past week. Only 108 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 59 yards on the ground, and a rushing touchdown. So we haven't seen Hurts throw for more than 236 passing yards since week 6, and he's only thrown over 260 passing yards 3 times on the season. He hasn't thrown for more than 179 passing yards in the last 3 games. They're going to run it with Saquon. They're going to run it near the goal line with Hurts. They're going to play defense. It's been working. So, I mean, they're winning football games. They don't care about our fantasy lineups, but Hurts is still a start for me, and I'm leaving it at that. He still has performed on the season as the QB4. Dallas Goedert going to be out again this week, so Grant Calcaterra is a sit for me. Was a streaming option last week, but that was due to matchup against the Panthers. 3 targets, 3 grabs, 16 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 10.6 fantasy points, but no teams on bye week this week. Tougher matchup. I'm avoiding Grant Calcaterra as a streaming option here in Week 15. All right, let's move on to Sunday Night Football and take a look at the Packers traveling to face the Seahawks. Jordan Love, my guy. J-Lo. I mean, the ceiling has kind of been missing. He was okay in Week 13, 18.9 fantasy points, fine in Week 11. But outside of that, in his last 4 starts, 14.7 or less fantasy points, 12 of 20 this past week, 206 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 23 yards on the ground. He's fine. Like, you're going to get these ceilings here and there, but they're running the football a lot right now. Josh Jacobs is scoring a lot of touchdowns. The wide receiver play is very inconsistent. Jacobs has 8 touchdowns in the last 4 games. Romeo Doubs is banged up. Jaden Reed, I feel like Jaden Reed is the new Voldemort. We don't even want to say his name. Sure, you can start Love if you need to, but just don't be too excited. Who knows what you're going to get? And this Seahawks defense has been better as of late for what it's worth. Now, Tucker Kraft is also in that type category, but he's been really solid the past 3 weeks. So 13.1 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. And we did see one game in there where he didn't score a touchdown and he still hit double digits. But outside of that game, he's only hit double digits on the season when he scored a touchdown. But he did score a touchdown this past week. 5 targets, 3 grabs, 41 receiving yards, a tutty, 13.1 fantasy points. But you just got to understand that Kraft is very risky because if he doesn't score a touchdown, he's probably not getting you double digits. But he is the tight end 5 on the season. So if you need to roll with him, don't be too upset about it. But understand he does have some volatility and risk involved. Geno Smith, I got a lot of questions about this past week as like a streaming option due to the bye weeks. And, I just don't get it. Like I've even gotten questions in the past couple of weeks. Like, can I start Geno? The question is just no, or the answer is just no. I mean, yeah, he had that big game against the Rams in week 9, but since week 6, he has 17 or less fantasy points in every game, and excluding 2 of those, 13 or less in every other game, or 14 or less. But yeah, I mean, he somehow ranks as the QB 13, but that's not saying a whole lot, So no, my answer is no. I'm avoiding Geno Smith. I don't even think he needs to be rostered. Maybe in a super flex type format, but even then, like, just start a wide receiver or something. Anyways, Noah Fant, AJ Barner, whoever is healthy for the Hawks, whoever is playing, there's no interest here from a tight end position. So avoiding Geno, avoiding Noah Fant, and Love, Kraft are fine, but depends on what else you got at the quarterback and tight end position here in Week 15. All right, moving along, we have 2 Monday Night Football games. Let's start with the Bears traveling to face the Vikings. I still think Caleb Williams is streamable. Last time he played the Vikings, he had 26.9 fantasy points. I know the Bears and company kind of came crashing back to earth against the Niners on the road. Caleb was 17 of 23, 134 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 27 yards on the ground. No interceptions, did have a lost fumble, still has not thrown a pick since week 6 against that filthy Jaguars defense. But the Vikings also very weak against opposing wide receivers, so there's going to be opportunity here for the passing game. Even if this is like a strong defensive performance, there'll be some garbage time like we saw this past week. So he's streamable, but I'll just leave it at that. I don't know if we're going to get some of these higher ceilings out of Caleb that we saw, but we certainly could, as he did have his best games on the season, well, as of late, against Minnesota and Detroit, and he plays Minnesota and Detroit in the next 2 weeks. So streamable, but that's it. Cole Kmet was on the field for 92% of snaps last week and had 0 targets, 0 catches. So he is a sit. Sam Darnold was my must-start quarterback of the week last week. And that paid off. 34.5 fantasy points, 22-28, 347 passing yards, 5 tutties, 7 yards on the ground, no turnovers. And I've been saying it for weeks, and I've been kind of screaming about it the past 2 or 3 weeks. Darnold is a start every single week. He's the QB7 on the season. You got the head scratcher against the Jags. Then you got the low performance against the Jets. And then you got week 1 where he only had 15 points. Outside of that, you have 17.2 or more fantasy points in every game. In the past 4 weeks, he has been absolute money. 2 or more passing touchdowns in every game. 19.6 or more fantasy points in every game. Keep rolling with Sam Darnold. Tougher matchup here, but the last time he played the Bears, he had 21 fantasy points. He's a strong start. Hawkinson lives in that streaming area. I keep catching heat for not being super high on Hawkinson. I mean, he hasn't been that good this season. He had a big game against the Jags. He had a big game against the Bears the last time they played, which was a tough matchup, but he's startable. But his stat lines in fantasy read as 5.7, 15.2, 3.3, 18.4, 5.8 and 8.5, and he still has yet to be on the field for more than 68% of snaps in a single game and dropped down to 62% of snaps this past week. Johnny Munt gets on the field. So, I mean, I don't know, right? And Josh Oliver also gets on the field as well. He was on the field for 50% of snaps this past week. So just bear that in mind. He's startable, but he's not going to have these double-digit games every single week, and the data definitely shows that. So we'll leave it at that. We'll see what happens in Week 15. And to wrap up Week 15, we're going to have the much-anticipated matchup between the Falcons and the Raiders. Let's start with Big Kirk O'Chains, who a quarterback that I've been very vocal about the past couple of weeks as being an absolute must-sit. And I have been talking about this for weeks and weeks, dating back to even some of the bigger performances out of Cousins on the season. And by some, I mean the 1 or 2 that he's had. You just can't trust Cousins. And like I said, I've been saying this for months now. I mean, you have 17 points against the Eagles, 35 against the Bucs, 28 against the Bucs, 17 against Dallas. Every other game on the season, he's had 12.5 or less fantasy points. And that has been my argument all season long. And the lows are so low: 8.2, 8.5, 9.1, 5.9, 6.1, 11.7 this past week against his former team, 23 of 37, 344 passing yards, 2 interceptions. You guys have now heard it repeated 100 times, right? 8 interceptions in the past 4 weeks, 0 touchdowns, 4 fumbles. You can't start Kirk Cousins even against the Raiders. Just no shot whatsoever. Kyle Pitts is probably a sit too, but I left him in the category for the sake of argument, and I will tell you this much. I have dropped Kyle Pitts already in leagues that I owned him. I'm not starting him personally, but the Raiders have been very bad against opposing tight ends on the season, giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the tight end position. So this might be a week where Kyle Pitts does something. Do you want to find out and take the gamble in the first round of the fantasy playoffs? Probably not, but the matchup is there. He's probably a sit, though. Okay, Aiden O'Connell might play, is the rumor. He has a knee bruise. Not as bad as they thought when he first went down in last week's matchup against the Bucs. I'm still going to sit him. I know he was fine in Week 13 at 19.6 fantasy points. You don't need to do this. You just don't. He has a very good playoff schedule, though. Atlanta this week, Jacksonville, New Orleans. So keep an eye on O'Connell in deeper formats, super flex, double QB, all that stuff. But I'm good. I'm good. Okay, I'm leaving it at that. Desmond Ridder, if he gets to start, I'm good. No thanks. I don't need to break it down for you guys. Brock Bowers will end the video on a high note. Is your tight end 2 on the season if you play quarterback? I don't know. He might rank pretty high for quarterbacks, but has moved down 1 spot after having a low performance this past week. 8.2 fantasy points, 5 targets, 3 grabs, 49 receiving yards, and maybe the kind of stifled quarterback play here will impact Bowers to a degree, but you just got to keep rolling with him. He's been fantastic all season long. Great strength of schedule here to wrap up the season. So you own Brock Bowers, don't think twice about it. He is an absolute must-start tight end here in Week 15. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single quarterback, every single tight end, and who you should be starting or sitting as we approach Week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season. As always, guys, I'll answer as many fantasy football questions in the comment section down below as I possibly can. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into the first round of the fantasy playoffs this season, please drop me a comment. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can. But most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content, because we're going to have everything you could possibly need to help you guys dominate the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.